During a special dinner, a millionaire arrives at an elegant restaurant where his girlfriend is already waiting for him. They sit together, and shortly after the woman gets up to go to the bathroom. A few moments later, the millionaire is startled to see a little beggar woman running towards his table. Panting, she whispers, "Uncle, don't eat that cake. She put something in it." Before his girlfriend returns, he decides to switch the cake plates. 2 hours later, the millionaire is completely shocked by what happens. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and tell us in the comments which city you are watching us from. The New York City autumn night had a sharp, electric feel. Arthur Sterling felt it as he stepped out of his black sedan, the sound of a distant siren echoing through the canyon of Fifth Avenue skyscrapers. He paused for a moment on the sidewalk, adjusting the cuff of his tailored shirt, a habitual gesture he used to ground himself before important moments. The restaurant, the Alabaster Room, was a bastion of calm and opulence, its tall windows casting an inviting golden glow that seemed to repel the frenetic energy of the city. For Arthur, a man who navigated this world of power with studied ease, this night was different. It carried an emotional weight that left him strangely vulnerable. He was not here to close a deal or to be seen, but to ask the most important question of his life. And for the first time in a long time, the outcome depended not on his negotiation skills, but on the sincerity of his heart. His eyes found Chloe across the room, and for a moment the noise of the city seemed to fade away. She was perfectly framed by the window, the glow of Manhattan serving as her personal backdrop. Chloe wasn't just beautiful, she was a work of New York art. Her black dress, a minimalist cut that had probably cost a fortune, exuded a polished, unwavering confidence. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant updo that looked both casual and meticulously planned. When she noticed him, a smile formed on her lips, a smile that was her trademark, charming, a little distant and always photogenic. Arthur felt that familiar tightness in his chest, a mix of admiration and genuine love. She was the perfect partner, the woman who complemented his life in a way he had always dreamed of. He felt that with her, his already successful life would finally be complete. Walking across the dining room was like walking through a minefield of power and influence. He recognized an investment banker at one table, a famous art curator at another. The air was thick with the scent of money and expensive perfume, and the background noise was a low hum of strategic conversation and controlled laughter. Every step Arthur took toward Chloe took him further away from his world of certainty and closer to a realm of pure emotion. He felt the outline of the small velvet box in his pocket, a talisman that held all his hopes. In a place like this, a marriage proposal was not just an act of love, it was almost a merger, the joining of two names, two brands, two potential dynasties. He knew their union would be celebrated in social circles as a brilliant move, but for him, tonight, it was all about her heart. "You're here," Chloe said as he leaned in to greet her. Her kiss was quick, a soft touch on his cheek that barely registered. "I was beginning to think the meeting with the Japanese had eaten you up." Her voice was soft and cultured, with the precision of someone who'd attended the best schools. Her hand rested briefly on his arm, her nails perfectly manicured. Arthur smiled, but as he sat down, he couldn't help but notice that her eyes, even as she spoke to him, seemed to scan the room, taking note of who was present, who was with whom. It was a habit of hers, always aware of her social surroundings, something he'd previously seen as part of her charm and intelligence. Tonight, though, for the first time, he felt a twinge of something different, the sense that he was just part of the show, not the main focus. "The meeting was a success, but my mind was here," he replied, trying to bring her focus back to them, to the intimacy of the table. Conversation began, flowing through the usual channels of their lives. A charity art auction she was organizing, their plans for a weekend in the Hamptons, the disappointing performance of a play on Broadway. It was elegant, polished conversation, the soundtrack to their privileged lives. Yet Arthur sensed a subtle emptiness beneath the surface of the words. He longed for a deeper connection, to talk about fears and dreams, but their conversation always seemed to orbit the outside world, the world of appearances and events. He found himself watching the passion with which she spoke about the guest list for the auction and wondered if she had ever spoken about him with that same fervor. On the other side of the restaurant's thick, soundproof glass, in a small gap between the building and a neighboring storefront, Lily's world was completely different. New York's reality for her was not made up of towering skyscrapers, but of the rough texture of brick against her back and the sour smell of damp garbage. The noise of the city was a constant assault, a cacophony of horns, sirens, and 1,000 voices that her brain struggled to process. To protect herself, she focused on small, repetitive things. Tonight, her focus was on a small ventilation grate at sidewalk level. The steam that rose from it in rhythmic puffs was predictable. One long puff, followed by 2 short ones. The pattern was her only anchor in an ocean of sensory chaos. The cold of the concrete seeped through her thin clothes, but the predictability of the steam kept her relatively calm on her little island of order. The sounds and smells of the alabaster room leaked into Lily's world in distorted ways. She didn't see the elegance, but she could feel the warmth emanating from the walls, a stark contrast to the chill of her alley. The smell of food was both a torture and a fascination. She could distinguish the buttery aroma of bread from the smell of grilled meat. It was data, information that she processed without the emotional component of hunger. Her attention was often drawn to the patterns of light dancing in the windows and the steady movement of people coming and going. She didn't see faces, but rhythms. The hurried gait of the businessman, the slow walk of the tourist couple, the efficient movement of the doorman. For Lily, New York was not a city of people, but a city of patterns, some frightening, others, like the steam from the ventilation, comforting. Arthur saw her as he entered the restaurant. A small, huddled figure almost blending into the shadows. Most people in his position would have looked away, quickened their pace, made the child invisible, as the city already did so well. Arthur stopped. He didn't say a word, knowing that silence is sometimes the kindest form of communication. He just looked at her for a second, a look that didn't contain pity, but a simple, deep acknowledgement of her existence. Then he turned, walked to a street vendor on the corner, bought a cup of hot chocolate and left it on the floor, a respectful distance from where she stood. He didn't wait for a thank you. For Lily, that act was extraordinary. The quiet man hadn't invaded her space, hadn't demanded a reaction. He had simply left a point of warmth and sweetness in her cold world, a new and comforting data in her system. Back in the warmth of the table, the conversation took a turn that set off a silent alarm bell in Arthur's mind. Chloe, under the guise of planning for their future, began to talk about his legacy. "Honey, with all your assets, the issue of estate planning is so vital," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "Have you thought about updating your will lately? It's so important to make sure everything is protected, that your wishes are respected no matter what." The question, posed with a tone of loving pragmatism, struck him oddly. It seemed too direct, too focused on a future without him. He tried to shake it off, telling himself that she was just being practical, a trait he had always admired in her. But the uncomfortable thought remained. She seemed more interested in his absence than his eternal presence. It was then that Chloe stood up. "I need to touch up my makeup, honey. I'll be back in a minute," she said. The same elegant gesture, the same quick promise. She set her small, expensive purse on the table. As she walked away, the cell phone inside her purse, which was face up, vibrated. The screen lit up for a moment, long enough for Arthur's eyes, by pure chance, to catch a preview of a message. The sender's name was just an initial, M. And the message, A fragment of text visible for less than 2 seconds was a short, brutal question. "Is it done yet?" The screen went dark, but the words burned into Arthur's mind, burning like a hot iron. A chill ran down his spine, a sense of dread so real and sudden that he could barely breathe. The vague unease of the entire night had just crystallized into a deafening alarm. Arthur froze, the hum of the restaurant receding into a distant, muffled sound. The words on his phone screen, "Done," repeated in his mind like an ominous mantra. Done. What? The question branched into a million possibilities, each darker than the last. His first inclination, that of a man in love, was to reach for an innocent explanation, a surprise party, a gift she had arranged. But that hope was fragile, easily crushed by the weight of the memories of the night. Her questions about his will, her distant gaze, the subtle coldness in her touch. The context transformed the question from a simple curiosity into a potential death sentence. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He stared at Chloe's empty chair, the red velvet fabric now looking ominous, like a throne waiting for tragedy. The feeling of dread was so physical that he felt a metallic taste in his mouth, the taste of fear. As Arthur fought his rising panic, Lily's attention in her chilly alley was caught by a deviation from the routine. The elegant woman, Chloe, did not head for the master bathroom, the path to which was visible from the entrance. Instead, she took a side hallway, an inconspicuous path that Lily knew from observation led to the service area and the kitchen staff entrance. To other patrons, her movement would be invisible or irrelevant. To Lily, who found security in the norms of behavior, this was a glaring anomaly. Guests did not go to this area. The woman was breaking the rules of the place, and Lily's mind, attuned to detect such deviations, fixed on her with absolute intensity. Lily's curiosity was not social, but systemic. Something was out of whack, and she had to watch until order was somehow restored. Lily crept silently to the edge of her hiding place, which gave her a partial view of a half-open service door. It was there that she saw the scene. Chloe was not speaking to the head chef, but to one of the younger kitchen helpers, a young man with an anxious face who was clearly unaccustomed to interacting with customers of that caliber. The conversation was a flash of furtive gestures and hurried whispers. Lily couldn't hear the words, but she could read the language of haste and secrecy. She saw Chloe's hand slide something small and dark into the boy's. A quick movement, almost a black market transaction taking place under the fluorescent lights of a service hallway. The tension between them was palpable even from a distance. This wasn't a special order. This was a conspiracy. From her new vantage point, Lily could now see part of the dessert assembly line through a service window. She saw the kitchen boy, his hands visibly shaking, approach a slice of dark chocolate cake, a piece that looked identical to all the others. Glancing nervously over his shoulder, he opened the small jar Chloe had given him. Lily saw a glint of clear liquid as he tilted the jar over the cake. A few drops fell, invisible against the dark frosting, but to Lily, the action was like an ink blot spreading across a blank page. The integrity of the object, the perfection of the dessert, had been violated. The cake was now wrong. It was broken, and in her world, broken things needed to be flagged or fixed. This cake could not follow its predetermined path. Lily's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. It wasn't a thought, but a physical impulse, a surge of energy that overwhelmed her. Her brain made an instant, unshakable connection. The wrong cake was destined for the quiet man, the one person who had punctured her bubble of invisibility with an act of quiet kindness. The equation in her mind was simple. The quiet man was a positive constant. The tainted cake was a dangerously negative variable. The collision of these two elements was a glitch in the system that she couldn't simply ignore. The fear of entering the restaurant, of facing the noise and the lights and the people, was immense. But the need to correct the trajectory of that event, to stop the breakdown from reaching its destination, was infinitely greater. It was a compulsion, a need as fundamental as breathing. She darted out of the shadows. The New York sidewalk hit her with all its force. The roar of a garbage truck, the headlights of a taxi that blinded her for a second, the stream of pedestrians that she had to dodge with the dexterity the street had taught her. She ran not to the main entrance, but to a service door that she had already mapped out from her observations. As she slipped inside, the restaurant assaulted her. The sudden heat, the overwhelming smell of hundreds of different dishes, the collision of conversation and laughter and piano music. For Lily, it was like diving into fire. Every nerve in her body screamed in protest, every instinct telling her to run, but the image of the wrong cake propelled her forward, a dark beacon guiding her through her personal hell. Arthur was still frozen, the image of the text of the message burning into his retina, when a disturbance in the corner of his eye made him turn. A small, ragged figure was moving quickly between the tables, a blur of urgency in a sea of elegant calm. The maitre d' saw her and began to move, his expression a mixture of shock and irritation. Arthur recognized her at once. It was the girl from the alley. His mind, already on high alert, tried to connect the dots. Chloe's message, the girl's sudden appearance. The events were surreal and seemed to converge on him, on this table, with terrifying speed. He felt that the night was about to break in a way he could never have imagined. Lily reached the table before anyone could stop her. She was panting, her small body shaking. True to her nature, she did not meet Arthur's eyes, her gaze fixed on a drop of condensation trickling down his water glass, a small line of order in the chaos. Leaning forward, she forced the words out, a hurried, fragmented whisper barely audible. "The cake," she gasped. "The chocolate one. Don't eat it." Her small hand rose and pointed vaguely toward the kitchen before falling to her side. The girl. She made it wrong. She did not use the word poison, a word that might not even have been part of her vocabulary. She used her own language, the language of order and disorder. To her, the cake was fundamentally wrong, and that was the most dangerous piece of information in the world. Lily's words weren't a warning, they were a clue. The moment she said, "the girl," she made it wrong. The phrase connected with the message he'd seen seconds before. Is it done? The girl. Chloe. What was done? The cake. The cake was wrong. The truth hit him with the force of a physical impact. It wasn't suspicion, it wasn't paranoia. It was a plan, a murder plan, and he was the target. The girl's warning wasn't a fantasy, it was confirmation of a reality so horrible that his mind had refused to accept it until that moment. He looked at the face of that child, dirty and panting, and felt a wave of gratitude so overwhelming that it left him breathless. That little soul, whom the world ignored, had just saved his life. Before Arthur could form a word of thanks, before he could even fully process the enormity of what had just happened, Lily was already walking away. She sensed the approach of the staff, and with the same survival instinct that guided her on the streets, she turned and ran, disappearing between the tables as quickly as she had appeared. Just as she was out of sight, the waiter arrived at the table, moving with theatrical calm, completely oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. On his silver tray sat two perfectly identical slices of chocolate cake. "A courtesy of our pastry chef, sir," the waiter said with a smile, "to celebrate your special evening." He placed one of the plates in front of Arthur. The beautiful, innocent dessert now looked like a serpent coiled on a porcelain plate. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. This helps a lot for those of us who are just starting out and continuing. Arthur's world had narrowed to that table, to those two slices of cake. The confirmation of danger brought no relief, but a chilling, terrifying clarity. The doubt had disappeared, replaced by the brutal question, what to do now? He felt a cold, deep anger bubbling beneath the surface, an anger not just at Chloe, but at himself, for his blindness, for mistaking a well-executed performance for true love. He stared at the cake, a marvel of confectionery with its perfect layers and shiny frosting, a symbol of celebration now transformed into a weapon. The duality of the object, its beauty and its lethality, was a perfect mirror of the woman sitting across from it. Outside, the incessant sound of New York continued, a city of 8 million stories, and his, at that very moment, had become a life-or-death thriller in the heart of Manhattan. Chloe returned, gliding into her seat with the grace of an actress entering the stage for the final act. She was radiant, a fresh, confident smile on her lips. Her calm and elegance were a stark contradiction to the turmoil that was exploding in Arthur's chest. Her presence forced him to compose himself, to bury his panic beneath a mask of normalcy. "Oh dear, they've brought the cake," she said, her voice laced with a childlike delight that now sounded macabre to him. "It looks absolutely sinful." Her choice of word, sinful, struck Arthur with a sickening irony. He had to force a smile in response, a movement of facial muscles that seemed to require superhuman strength. He was in a duel of appearances, and his life depended on his performance being as convincing as hers. "We had a little commotion while you were gone," Arthur said, his voice carefully calibrated to sound casual as he tested her reaction. "A girl from the street got in and ran all the way here." He watched her face like a hawk. He saw a flash of fury in her eyes, a deep-seated irritation at the unpredictability, at the variable that had not been part of his plan, but it was instantly covered by a layer of social disdain. "How awful! The security of this place isn't what it used to be," she said, shaking her head in mock concern. "I hope they dealt with her. Anyway, let's not let this ruin our moment, shall we?" His complete lack of interest in why the girl had come to him specifically, his hasty desire to dismiss the incident, was deafening. To Chloe, Lily wasn't a person. She was an inconvenience. Dessert was now the center of their universe. Chloe's focus on the cake was absolute, her eyes shining with an anticipation that Arthur now understood to be sinister. He watched her pick up the silver fork, admiring the way the light danced on the metal. "You first, darling," she suggested, her voice a soft velvet. "After all, the evening is all yours." Kindness was a weapon, a courtesy that hid a countdown. Her every word, her every gesture, now felt like part of a deadly script. He was no longer the man she loved. He was the target, the final obstacle between her and his fortune. And he was being invited to participate in his own execution with a smile in one of the most expensive restaurants in New York. The city outside pulsed with life, completely oblivious to the fact that at this table, life was about to be traded. Arthur's mind, trained to find solutions in high-stakes negotiations, was working at high speed. Accusing her was unthinkable. He didn't know who M was, didn't know the extent of the conspiracy. A direct accusation might alert others, put his life in even greater danger. Refusing to eat the cake wasn't an option either. The alarm would be raised immediately. He needed a way to flip the script, to turn her trap into a laboratory, to prove his own theory. That was when the plan came to him, a desperate maneuver, an all-or-nothing move. Switch the plates. The idea was so bold and risky that his heart raced even faster. If he was wrong, it would be the end of everything he knew. If he was right, he would become the master of ceremonies for her fate. The decision was made in the silence of a second, an act of silent war waged over a white linen tablecloth. He needed a believable distraction, an act that would break the flow of the evening for a moment. His body moved with intent disguised as accident. His hand, gesturing as he spoke, brushed against his glass of red wine. The glass tipped over, spilling a dark red trail across the pristine white tablecloth like a wound opening. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," he exclaimed, his voice filled with mock embarrassment. The wine stains spread, a beautiful catastrophe that immediately caught the attention of Chloe and a nearby waiter. The look of pure annoyance on Chloe's face at this blemish on her perfect evening was just the distraction he needed. She was more concerned with the aesthetics of the scene than the man in front of her, and in that moment he knew she wasn't paying attention to anything else. As the waiter hurried to the table with a napkin and Chloe scolded him for his clumsiness, Arthur leaned forward as if to help contain the damage. "Let me help," he said, moving his plate of cake aside to make room. In that movement, under the guise of the minor crisis, his hands acted with a speed and precision that adrenaline granted him. In one fluid, almost invisible movement, he pushed her plate in front of her and pulled his own into its place. The switch was done in less than 2 seconds, a deadly magic trick hidden in plain sight, masked by the drama of the spilled wine. The waiter, focused on the stain, saw nothing. Chloe, focused on her irritation, saw nothing. The deed was done. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs, but his face showed only the relief of someone who had overcome a minor social embarrassment. "There, crisis averted," he said, forcing a laugh. "I think I need another glass of wine to calm my nerves." He looked at her, straight in the eyes, and felt as if he were looking at a stranger. The woman he had planned to propose to had become his adversary in a deadly game. The need to maintain the facade of love and normality was physically exhausting. He was an actor in his own play, and the script had changed without warning. He had to stay in character until the end of the act, not knowing how the story would end. He watched her for any sign that she had noticed the change. A blink, a hesitation, anything. But Chloe's composure was a fortress. She simply looked at the wine stain with disdain, then at the cake in front of her with renewed interest. "Be more careful, dear," she said, her tone barely concealed. "Now let's eat before another catastrophe happens." Her haste to return to the cake, her complete disregard for his state of mind, was the final confirmation. To her, he was merely a means to an end, and the end was there on a china plate waiting to be consumed. Her coldness was no longer subtle. It was a force of nature, and he was at the center of it. The decisive moment had arrived, the point of no return. Arthur picked up his fork and cut a piece of the cake in front of him, the cake that was supposed to be hers, the safe cake. The chocolate flavor was intense, but all he could taste was the metallic taste of fear. His eyes, however, were not on his plate. They were fixed on her. He watched her cut her own slice of cake with an elegant, deliberate movement. He watched her lift her fork, the poisoned dessert inches from her lips. Time seemed to stand still. The sounds of the restaurant, the city outside, everything disappeared. There was only him, her, and that small piece of cake that held their fate. He saw her smile at him, one last smile before she sealed her own fate and lifted the fork to her mouth. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. This helps a lot for those of us who are just starting out and continuing. Chloe took her first bite with a sigh of pleasure. Absolutely divine," she said, her voice perfectly calm. "You have to try yours, dear. Their reputation is well deserved." For a terrifying second, Arthur's world swayed. What if it was all just monumental paranoia? What if the message was a coincidence, and the girl's warning the ravings of a child? Chloe's lack of immediate reaction plunged him back into a sea of doubt. He felt like a monster, a man who, in his distrust, had doomed the woman he loved. With trembling hands, he lifted the fork to his mouth and took a bite of his own cake. It tasted of dark chocolate and berries, but to him, it tasted like ash and betrayal. He forced a smile, nodding, while inside, his soul writhed in agony, torn between the intuition that screamed danger and the logic that accused him of madness. The minutes that followed were the longest of his life. Time seemed to have become a thick, slow substance. The waiter came and cleared the dessert plates with a professional smile, oblivious to the silent war that was being waged at that table. They ordered coffee. Conversation resumed, but it was a ghost of normality. They talked about the stock market, about a new exhibition at MoMA, but the words were hollow, just sounds to fill the tense silence. Arthur responded automatically, but every fiber of his being was tuned to Chloe. He watched the way she held the porcelain cup, the rhythm of her breathing, the light in her eyes, and he saw nothing, absolutely nothing. Her normality was torture, a suspense that stretched him to the breaking point, making him question his own sanity with every passing second. 20 minutes passed, 20 minutes of shallow conversation that felt like a lifetime. And then it happened. The first sign. It was tiny. Chloe stopped mid-sentence about a charity auction and brought her fingertips to her forehead, frowning slightly. "Ugh, that's a weird twinge in my head," she said, trying to laugh. "I guess the work week finally caught up with me." The excuse was perfect, the complaint banal. But to Arthur, it was like the snap of a twig in the silent forest. It was the first hint, the first proof that the reality he'd been dreading was in fact unfolding. A chill ran down his spine, a horrible sensation that was a mix of utter dread and dark, terrible vindication. He wasn't crazy, and the nightmare was only just beginning. He had to keep playing the concerned boyfriend. He leaned across the table, putting on a mask of tender concern. "Are you okay, honey? Would you like some water? We can leave if you're not feeling well. I'll call the car." The offer to leave was her chess move. If her plan was to make him sick here, she would insist on staying. Her response was immediate and exactly as he expected. "No, of course not, honey. I'm just tired," she said, forcing a smile to reassure him. "I'm not going to let a silly headache ruin our evening. It'll pass in a little while." Her refusal, her desire to stay at the crime scene, was like a spotlight illuminating her true intentions. She was waiting for the poison to take effect on him, unaware that the countdown had begun for her. From that moment on, Arthur began to notice the small chinks in her armor. They were details that anyone else would ignore, but to him, they were neon signs flashing in the darkness. He saw a barely perceptible tremor in her hand as she lifted her coffee cup, a tremor she quickly tried to disguise by holding the cup with both hands. He saw a thin layer of sweat glistening on her temple, despite the restaurant's perfectly tuned air conditioning, and when she laughed at one of his forced jokes, the sound came out a little higher, a little less controlled. They were the tiny cracks forming in the surface of her porcelain facade, and Arthur watched them with the terrified fascination of someone watching a building collapse in slow motion. The most surreal thing for Arthur was watching the genuine confusion that was beginning to fill Chloe's eyes. She was clearly feeling the symptoms, but the cause was incomprehensible to him. This shouldn't be happening to her. She looked at him, at his calm, healthy face, and then at herself, and the bewilderment on her face was undeniable. Why was she feeling dizzy? Why was her head throbbing? He could see the gears in her brain turning, trying to find a logical explanation for an illogical situation. Anxiety began to replace her composure. Her movements became a little more jerky, her smile a little tighter. The predator was beginning to realize that perhaps she was the prey. The deterioration was undeniable. Chloe's facade cracked completely. Her breathing became labored, and she clutched her stomach, her face paling visibly. The fork she had been holding fell from her hand, clattering to the plate with a sharp thud. "Arthur," she whispered, and her voice was no longer the controlled lilt it had once been. It was weak, thin, filled with a fear she could no longer hide. I'm not okay. Really. Everything is spinning." The powerful woman, the Manhattan socialite who commanded rooms with a look, was gone. In her place was a frightened and sick person, losing control of her own body, confronted by a force she had unleashed, but now turned against her. The time had come. Arthur felt no need to shout or make a speech. Revenge, he realized, was a dish best served cold and silent. He leaned forward, his face now a mask of icy neutrality, devoid of any trace of the love he had once felt. He looked straight into her eyes, which were now wide and panicked, and asked the question that would end it all. In a low, clear, emotionless voice, he asked, "What did you think was going to happen tonight, Chloe?" The question was not a request for information. It was a mirror. A mirror he held up to her so she could see the reflection of her own plan, her own evil, at the very moment it consumed her. His words, spoken with that deadly calm, were the final piece of the puzzle in Chloe's fevered mind. She looked at his face, at the absence of panic or worry, and she understood. The girl's intrusion. The spilled glass of wine. The switch. The word echoed in her mind like a gunshot. The switch. He had known, and he had made her drink her own medicine. The horror that spread across her face was absolute. It was not just the physical pain, but the intellectual shock of having been so completely outwitted, of having her web of deceit turned against her so ironically and fatally. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to deny, perhaps to plead, but no sound came out. There was only the terrible, silent realization that her trap had closed on her. Despite the coldness in his heart, Arthur was not a monster. He would not watch her die without doing anything. He had protected himself. He had survived. That was enough. Revenge was not in his nature. With a decisive movement he stood, his presence at the table now imposing and commanding. He signaled sharply to the maitre d', who was watching them from a distance with growing alarm. His voice, when he spoke, was firm, clear, and unquestioning, cutting through the murmur of the restaurant. "Call an ambulance," he ordered, "immediately." The command was a full stop to the private drama. The door to the outside world, with its sirens, its questions, and its consequences, had just been flung open, and Arthur was ready to face it. Arthur's command, clear and authoritative, cut through the haze of shock that had settled over the alabaster room. The maitre d', a man trained to deal with crises of spilled wine and double reservations, was now faced with a human meltdown, and his composure crumbled. He hurried to a telephone, his hands shaking. The whispers among the diners turned into an audible buzz of alarm and morbid speculation. The facade of Manhattan sophistication, so carefully maintained in this room, cracked and crumbled, revealing beneath it the raw, ugly mess of real life. Arthur watched it all with a strange, cold lucidity. He felt as if his spirit had separated from his body, floating near the ceiling, watching a scene that could not possibly be his, but undeniably was. The epicenter of this chaos was his table, his life. As panic spread around him, Arthur's mind operated with surgical precision. The vulnerable, passionate man who had arrived here hours earlier was gone. In his place was a strategist focused on survival. He stared at Chloe, now a pathetic, contorted figure in her chair, and catalogued her symptoms with the detachment of an emergency room doctor. The pallor, the shallow breathing, the sweating, the impending loss of consciousness. He ran through the timeline, the events, the words, solidifying the narrative in his mind, not to mourn, but to defend himself. He knew that soon every second of that night would be dissected by people who didn't know him, and who would, by default, suspect him. The pain of betrayal had been replaced by the pragmatic need to protect himself. In a final spasm of awareness, Chloe's eyes opened and met his. There was a plea in them, a mixture of terror and pleading. Her hand moved weakly across the table, her fingers reaching for him. Was this the last gesture of a manipulator or the final scream of a terrified person? To Arthur, it no longer mattered. The woman he had known, or thought he knew, had dissolved into that tragic figure. He looked at her hand and made no move to take it. His face remained a mask of neutrality. Her refusal to offer that last comfort was her final, silent verdict. The man she had tried to erase from the world was no longer there to offer forgiveness or comfort. He was now merely a witness to its consequences. In the midst of the confusion, as the restaurant staff tried in vain to form a human barrier around the table, a clear and urgent thought cut through the noise in Arthur's mind. The cell phone, Chloe's cell phone, the message from M. It was the only piece of tangible evidence in a story that would have sounded like fiction. With a movement that seemed perfectly natural for a worried boyfriend packing his partner's belongings, he picked up Chloe's elegant bag from the chair. His fingers, acting with a calm that belied the storm in his chest, found the smooth, cool device. He slid it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. The weight of the cell phone against his body was comforting. It was a weapon, the only one he would have in the battle he knew was coming. The arrival of the ambulance was an invasion of reality. The sound of the siren rising to a shriek in front of the restaurant silenced all other noise. Two paramedics, dressed in practical uniforms that seemed out of place amid the luxury, entered with a stretcher and bags of equipment. They moved with a focused urgency that transformed the scene from an uncomfortable drama into a critical emergency. Their presence, with their technical language and quick actions, made the tragedy official. It was no longer a secret kept at that table. It was a fact, an event that would be documented, reported, and inevitably judged. For Arthur, they were the line that separated the before and after. "What happened here, sir?" the older paramedic asked, already kneeling beside Chloe, his fingers searching for her pulse. The questions came fast, direct, with no room for hesitation. What did she eat? Did she drink? Do she have any known allergies? Is she on any medication? Arthur answered with forced calm, choosing each word carefully. "We had dinner. We had the same thing. The main course, the wine, and then this chocolate cake." He gestured to the untouched plate in front of him and her empty plate. He knew he was providing the facts that would incriminate himself, the man who had eaten the same meal and was perfectly fine. He was knowingly setting his own trap for the authorities, knowing that the full truth was his only and unlikely way out. The younger paramedic rattled off the vital signs to his partner, and the older one frowned. Classic signs of acute poisoning. Her pupils are dilated. He glanced at Chloe's face, pale and covered in sweat, then fixed his gaze on Arthur for a second longer than necessary. "And are you feeling okay? No symptoms?" he asked. The question was routine, but the tone was searching. In that moment, Arthur stopped being a concerned boyfriend and became a variable in the equation, the anomaly, the healthy man at the scene of a poisoning. The first seed of official suspicion was planted there under the golden lights of the alabaster room. The decision to transport her was immediate. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, the entire restaurant watched in deathly silence. The sound of the stretcher's wheels on the marble floor was the only noise. "Will you be coming to the hospital with us?" one of the paramedics asked. "Yes," Arthur replied, his voice firm. To flee the scene would be an admission of guilt. He needed to be there for every step. As he stood, his eyes swept the room and fixed for a moment on the kitchen door. He saw the face of the young helper, the same one Lily had seen. The boy was white as a ghost, his eyes wide with sheer terror. When their eyes met, the boy retreated into the shadows of the kitchen. That was all Arthur needed to know. There were accomplices, and they were terrified. Inside the ambulance, the chaos of New York City blurred past the windows. The interior of the vehicle was a world apart, a sterile cocoon of electronic beeps and doctor's orders. Arthur sat, watching the paramedics try to save the life of the woman he had planned to make his wife an hour ago. The reality of the situation hit him full force. He had survived, but the war was far from over. His mind turned to Lily, a small, vulnerable girl who was now the only witness who could corroborate his insane story. And if Chloe had accomplices, Lily was no longer just a witness. She was a target. The protective instinct he had felt for her became a crushing responsibility. He had to not only prove her innocence, but ensure her safety. Patient en route to Mount Sinai, exhibiting signs of acute toxic substance ingestion, possible poisoning. The paramedic's voice came over the radio, calm and professional. "NYPD has been notified and will meet us at the emergency room." The words NYPD dropped like stones in Arthur's stomach. It was done. The legal machinery had been activated. He was no longer a civilian. He was part of a criminal investigation. He felt the weight of Chloe's cell phone in his pocket. At that moment, in the eyes of the world, he was the prime suspect in an attempted murder, and his only defense was a story about an invisible girl who saw the world in a way no one else could. Arrival at the emergency room at Mount Sinai Hospital was an explosion of organized urgency. The ambulance doors opened to a world of fluorescent lights, rhythmic beeping, and the hustle and bustle of doctors and nurses. Chloe was whisked away, her stretcher disappearing down a hallway, swallowed up by the efficient, impersonal machinery of emergency medicine. For a moment, Arthur stood in the ambulance bay, the cool New York night air a stark contrast to the sterile heat of the hospital. The transition had been brutal and complete. In the space of a few hours, he had gone from the height of luxury and romance to the epicenter of a crisis. A stranger in his own life, stripped of all the power and control he had ever taken for granted. He was now in a territory governed by protocols and procedures he could not influence. Before he could take more than 2 steps inside, 2 men approached. Their clothes were plain clothes, but their looks and postures screamed, "Police!" They were detectives. "Mr. Sterling?" the older man asked, a man with a tired face who looked like he'd seen every facet of the city. "I'm Detective O'Malley, and this is my partner, Detective Riley. We need to ask you a few questions." The approach was calm, almost monotone, but the title detective and the seriousness in his eyes were confirmation. The line had been crossed. He was no longer the concerned boyfriend. He was officially part of a criminal investigation by the NYPD, and his every word from that moment on would be weighed and measured against him. They led him down a hallway, past the main waiting room, to a small consulting room at the back. The place was cold and anonymous, with clinical white walls, a metal desk, 3 plastic chairs, and a faint smell of disinfectant. The door closed with a click that echoed in the silence, cutting him off from the rest of the world. It was a room designed for the extraction of facts, devoid of any comfort or distraction. Arthur sat down, feeling the cool plastic of the chair through his expensive suit. A man accustomed to commanding wood-paneled conference rooms with panoramic views, he was now in a white box, under the watchful eye of 2 men who had the power to destroy what was left of his life. "Mr. Sterling, can you tell us in detail how your evening went?" Riley, the younger detective, began, a notepad in his hand. Arthur took a deep breath, making a split-second choice. The truth, the complete, unvarnished truth, was the only option. Trying to hide or manipulate the facts would only make him look more guilty when the inevitable inconsistencies emerged. "We went to the Alabaster Room to celebrate our 2-year anniversary," he began, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. And he told her. He told her about the conversation, about his sense that something was wrong, about Chloe's questions about his will. And then he told her about the message on her phone. He was building his defense, brick by brick, knowing that the foundation of his story was almost unbelievable. And then a girl showed up, Arthur continued, getting to the hard part. He described Lily, her appearance, her behavior, his assumption that she was autistic, and then he related her warning. The words, "the girl," "she made it wrong," sounded even more fragile and childish in that sterile room than they had in the restaurant. And finally, he confessed to the act that put him at the center of the crime, the switching of the plates. He looked at the detectives' faces as he spoke, seeing their professional neutrality soften into an expression that was a mixture of pity and deep skepticism. He sounded like a desperate man, concocting an elaborate fantasy to cover up a terrible crime. He knew it, and the realization left him with a sense of icy despair. Detective O'Malley, the older one, sighed, a sound of sheer exhaustion. "Let me get this straight, Mr. Sterling," he said. his voice void of belief. "You're supposed to believe that a street urchin you barely knew found out about an attempted murder and tipped you off, and that based on that tip-off, you switched the cake plates, causing your girlfriend to accidentally poison herself with a poison she brought in herself. Is that your official statement?" The way he summarized the story, stripping it of all emotion and context, made it sound like the script for a B-movie. Arthur felt the ground drop out from under his feet. They didn't believe a word of it. Watching the disbelief solidify on the detectives' faces, Arthur felt a wave of panic. He was losing. The truth was so extraordinary that it seemed like the most obvious lie. It was then that he remembered his only piece of physical evidence. "I can prove part of it," he said, his voice taking on a new intensity. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out Chloe's cell phone, placing it carefully on the metal table. The device, an icon of status and communication, now lay between them like a black box of disaster. Her cell phone. "The message I saw was from a contact M. The answers are in there. I grabbed it from her bag before the ambulance arrived." Admitting it was a risk, but it was all he had. The gesture of placing the phone on the table changed the energy in the room. It was no longer just his word against logic. Now there was an object. Potential evidence. Detective O'Malley looked at the phone, then back at Arthur. "Are you giving us this device voluntarily?" he asked, his tone more serious now, less condescending. "Yes," Arthur replied, "because it's the truth." O'Malley took the phone carefully, placing it in an evidence bag. He hadn't promised anything, hadn't said he believed it, but the dynamic had changed. Arthur's story, as crazy as it was, now had a physical appendage that needed to be investigated. It was a small victory, a ray of light in what seemed like total darkness. As the detectives quietly discussed the warrant procedures among themselves, Arthur's mind leapt to a horrifying conclusion. Lily. He had just told the police about the one witness who could save him, but in doing so, he had also unwittingly painted a target on her back. If M and whoever else was involved discovered that the plan had failed so spectacularly, the first question would be, why? They would trace the events of the night. They would learn about the commotion at the restaurant. They would learn about the girl who had run up to the table. To a criminal organization, an eyewitness, especially a vulnerable child with no trace, was not a problem to be managed. It was a problem to be eliminated. Fear for his own legal status evaporated, replaced by pure protective terror. He had inadvertently placed his rescuer's life in unimaginable danger. He stood, interrupting the detective's conversation. "The girl," he said, his voice filled with an urgency that had nothing to do with his own defense. "Her name is Lily. You need to find her, now, not as a witness, but as a person in danger. If these people are real, they won't hesitate to silence a street kid. No one would miss her." The passion in his voice, the genuine fear for another person, was the most compelling thing he had said in that room. For once, he didn't sound like a suspect. He sounded like a man with something infinitely more precious to lose than his own freedom. Arthur's plea, weighted with genuine selfless fear, was the turning point in the small hospital room. Detectives O'Malley and Riley exchanged a look that went beyond procedure. They watched the transition from a man defending his own life to a man defending that of a child. There was a truth to it that no story, no matter how well told, could fabricate. "Okay, Mr. Sterling," O'Malley said, his voice losing its skeptical edge. He picked up the radio. "I'm going to issue an alert to all patrol units in Midtown. Female, approximately 6 years old, name Lily, possible witness and at risk. Approach with caution." The police machine, once a threat to Arthur, now mobilized to become Lily's shield. For the first time that night, Arthur felt like he was no longer fighting alone. The next few hours were an exercise in agony and helplessness. Left under the watchful eye of a uniformed police officer, Arthur waited in a silence filled only by the distant, constant sound of hospital life. He could do nothing. He could not run through the streets of New York. He could not use his vast network of contacts. He could not mobilize his resources. He was just a man in a waiting room, completely helpless, while the fate of a child was decided by others. In that enforced stillness, he reflected on the irony of his life. He, a master of the universe in his world, a man who could move markets with a phone call, could do nothing to protect the one person who truly mattered. The realization of his own futility was the final blow to his former self. It was almost dawn when Detective O'Malley returned. His face was serious, his steps heavy, and his entire posture exuded the gravity of a confirmed truth. "The warrant came out faster than expected," he said bluntly. "You were right about everything, Sterling." Chloe's phone, he explained, was a Pandora's box. There were explicit conversations with M, a financial advisor who had lost his license years before, detailing the plan, the type of poison, and how they would make Arthur's death look like a heart attack. And there was the list. A list of other wealthy single men with dossiers on their routines and finances. Arthur's story wasn't just true. It was the key to stopping a series of potential murders. As Arthur absorbed the validation of his words, a doctor approached the group. His expression was solemn. "Mr. Sterling," he began, his voice soft, "I am sorry to inform you, the patient, Miss Chloe, has gone into cardiac arrest that we were unable to reverse. She passed away 20 minutes ago." The news fell into the sterile air of the hospital like a stone. Arthur felt no joy, no vengeance. He felt a deep weariness and a hollow sadness. The woman he had loved, the woman he had been ready to propose to, was dead. And the final image he would have of her would not be of her smiling face on the beach, but of her face contorted in horror as she realized the trap she had created. It was a tragic and lonely end to a life consumed by greed. With the conspiracy confirmed, the NYPD investigation exploded into a high-priority operation. Finding Lily became a race against time. The detectives now knew that Chloe's accomplices, upon realizing their silence, would panic and move quickly to eliminate any witnesses. New York City, with its millions of hiding places, seemed vast and threatening. Every minute that passed was another minute for the criminals to find her. The teams visited shelters, soup kitchens, subway stations, showing them the photo of a girl who, to most of the world, was invisible. For Arthur, every second of waiting was torture, the image of Lily's frightened face haunting his thoughts. Though physically restrained, Arthur became an active part of the search. He spent more than an hour with the detectives, not just describing Lily's appearance, but trying to describe her soul. "Don't look for her in noisy or chaotic places," he insisted. "She'll run away from that. Look for her in a place with order, with patterns, a library, a museum, maybe even a church, somewhere she can feel safe in the quiet and the structure. She won't cry or call for help. She'll watch. She's a watcher." He was trying to give them a map into her mind, using the empathy he'd discovered that night to guide their search. He was becoming her translator for a world that didn't understand her. Arthur's tip proved to be the key. A young police officer, patrolling the area near the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue, remembered the millionaire's words about order and silence. On a hunch, he entered the stately Rosemane reading room. And there, at one of the long oak tables, seated in a chair too large for her, was Lily. She was not reading. She was looking up at the ornate ceiling with its frescoes of clouds and sky, an intricate and beautiful pattern. She had found the most orderly and quiet place she could imagine in the heart of the noisiest city in the world. When the police officer approached her calmly, she just looked at him, her eyes wide and serious. She was safe. The news reached Arthur by telephone, and he collapsed into a chair, crying for the first time that night, not from fear or grief, but from a relief so profound that it seemed as if his own heart were being saved for the second time. The reunion was held in a child counselor's office, a calm and safe environment. When Arthur entered, Lily was sitting on the floor, arranging wooden blocks in a perfectly straight line. He did not rush toward her. He sat on the floor a short distance away and began to make his own line of blocks parallel to hers. They sat like that for several minutes, in shared silence, communicating not with words, but with the language of patterns and space. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft. "Hi, Lily. I'm Arthur. You've been very brave." She didn't respond, but picked up one of her blocks and placed it at the end of his line, connecting the two. In that simple gesture, a family began. A silent promise was made, not of gratitude, but of belonging. The dismantling of the criminal network made headlines for weeks. The high society poisoning plot, the newspapers screamed. Arthur ignored it all. His attention, his resources, his entire life were now focused on one thing: Lily. He began the adoption process, mobilizing his legal team not for hostile takeovers, but for building a home. He created a foundation, not in his name, but in hers, dedicated to providing support for neurodivergent children on the streets. The fortune that had nearly killed her had found its true purpose: to become a shield for the most vulnerable, a tool to ensure that other Lilies would not have to live in the shadows. Months later, in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, the most important sound was not the city outside, but the soft click of building blocks. Arthur was on the floor, building a tower with Lily. She was focused, at peace. At one point she stopped, looked directly at him, a rare and precious eye contact, and gave a small smile. In that moment, Arthur understood what true wealth was. It was not the skyscraping buildings outside, but the safe little world he was building inside. It was not the power to command boardrooms, but the honor of being worthy of a child's trust. The man who thought he had it all realized he had nothing until he met the girl who, in the eyes of the world, was nobody. And that was the greatest and most valuable acquisition of his life. She did not seek to be a heroine. Perhaps she did not even understand the danger she was in. She only saw a breakdown in the world order and in her silence acted to fix it, eventually giving a man his life back and herself the chance at a future. Sometimes life surrounds us with luxury and power, making us believe we have it all, until the most intimate betrayal shows us the emptiness behind the facade. But it is precisely when the ground collapses that we discover what truly has value. The strength that lies in a gesture of pure empathy, the wisdom of listening to a voice that the world ignores, and the courage to start over, not with more wealth, but with more purpose. If this story touched your heart, as well as forever sealing the fate of Arthur and Lily, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other journeys that remind us of what really matters. Seeing the hero in whom the world doesn't even notice.